Hello, and welcome to the weekly sermon podcast with Reverend Marie Duquette. You can find the full live version service on YouTube's Be Ye Lifted.
Holy Gospel according to Mark, chapter 6.
Glory to you, Lord.
Now Jesus left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many women and men who heard him were astounded, saying, "Where did this man learn this? And what wisdom has been given him? And such deeds of power work done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they were offended over him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house." And he could do no deed of power there except on a few sick people, laying hands and curing them. And Jesus was amazed at their unbelief. Then he went about among the villages teaching the gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. We have about 4 weeks left to explore Wil Gafney's lectionary for the whole church, year C. At Advent this year, the last Sunday of November, we will switch back to the Revised Common Lectionary for a time. This has been an interesting and an educational experience for me, and I hope that it has been for you. The biggest reason we're switching back to the Revised Common Lectionary is that Wil Gafney is writing an entire series, one for each year of the church year, A, B, and C. She has 2 done. She doesn't have the other 2 done. And as a result, every Sunday we had to scramble to find resources that worked with these readings. So we're going to switch back to the RCL in about 4 weeks, 4 or 5. But I'm glad that we did this, and I appreciate your support in doing it. I do want to say, from the back page of her book, Wil Gafney is a Hebrew biblical scholar and Episcopal priest, a former Army chaplain, a congregational pastor in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, a graduate of Duke and Howard universities, and she currently is employed at Bright Divinity School. I tell you all that to say that, you know how when you play a sport, they always say if you want to get better, you want to play against somebody that's better than you? This woman is so much better than me. And I have had to reach and fuss and cross-reference and research almost every week in ways that I did not before. Her mission has been to center readings about women and children throughout Scripture that normally are not read in church. And boy, don't we know that from some of the readings that we have heard. And therefore, I'm going to read to you now from 2 Samuel, and I could not quite, 2 Samuel chapter 20, I could not quite ask an assisting minister to read this, as it is about a woman who defends her town. Well, you'll hear. Now among the people there was by chance a worthless man named Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjaminite. He sounded the trumpet and cried out, "We have no portion in David, no share in Jesse's son. Every man back to his tent, Israel." Then all the men of Israel left from behind David and went behind Sheba, son of Bichri, while the men of Judah clung to their king from the Jordan to Jerusalem. And David came to his Jerusalem house, and the king took the 10 low-status wives whom he had left to watch the house and put them under watch in a guardhouse. And he provisioned them, but did not go to them. So were they confined until the day of their death, a living widowhood. Then Sheba passed through all the tribes of Israel to Abel of Beth-makkah, and all the Bichrites assembled, and they went behind him. They came and lay siege against him in Abel of Beth-makkah. They threw up a siege ramp against the city, and it stood against the rampart. Joab's people were dismantling the wall to bring it down. Then a wise woman called from the city, "All of you, listen, listen. Tell Joab now, come here, and I will speak to you." So he drew near to her, and the woman said, "Are you Joab?" He answered, "I am." Then she said, "They used to say this saying in former times, 'Let them ask at Abel, and thus would settle the matter.' I am among the most peaceful and faithful in Israel, and you seek to put to death a city and a mother in Israel. Why would you swallow up the heritage of the Most High God?" Joab answered, Far be it from me that I should swallow up or dismantle. The matter is not thus. Rather, a man from the hills of Ephraim, Sheba, son of Bichri is his name, has raised up his hand against David, against the king. Give him up, just him, and I will go from the city." Then the woman said to Joab, "Look, his head shall be thrown to you beyond the wall." Then the woman went to all the people with her wisdom. So they cut off the head of Sheba, son of Bichri. Then they threw it to Joab. And he blew the trumpet, and they dispersed from the city, and all went to their homes, while Joab returned to Jerusalem to the king. This is the gospel of the Lord. This is harsh, right? This is harsh. Even I saw it and said, "Are you kidding me? We're going to play volleyball with some guy's head this week?" It's an arresting story. On the other hand, I'm going to venture a guess here that a couple of you in this sanctuary have watched, I don't know, a horror film or two, have followed a crime show or four, have read stories about grisly events, and then went and read some more about the same event because you wanted more details. This is what humans do. Why? I don't know. Maybe it's so that if we look at that happening out there, we won't think about it happening in here. At any rate, I want to read to you now the commentary, the thoughts that Wil Gafney wrote about how these four lessons hang together, because I found it fascinating, and Lord knows I couldn't pull it together without her help. She writes, "The struggle for survival in the ancient world was a bloody business on a good day. Add throne games into the mix, and the slaughter could be epic. Many of those epic battles, real and imaginary, are churned out for small and large screens and consumed with gusto. Some few women swashbuckle through these productions. Their heroines seem far removed from the domesticated and domesticating construct of biblical womanhood. Presaging the good of the many outweighs the good of the one, this woman, rendered anonymous though famous in her time, excised the threat to her community, her children, all of the occupants of her city, brutally." Now, I want to stop there for just a moment. If that is what she did, and a wise woman, say in Ukraine, had been able to do the same and thus stop the slaughter and destruction that we have all witnessed for a month, would we want to know her story? You bet. When read as a human animal, or even as a God figure, she is ensuring the survival of her brood and acknowledging a terrifying reality that not everyone will survive. Not everyone will be saved. She sits in the throne of judgment and issues a death sentence. And at the same time, the responsibility for his fate falls on the condemned man who undertook actions he knew carried a death sentence. The terrible choice here is how to save as many as possible. Send one to his death. I don't imagine civil and religious leaders, or by analogy, mothers, having to decide to kill or have killed one of their constituents. But there do come times when a member, family member, or friend may, and perhaps must, be relinquished to a destructive path that leads to death. And therein is wisdom. Though there are some actions from which there is no coming back, some relationships which cannot be mended, with God there is always the possibility of salvation. The psalm reads as a rebuke to the man who earned his condemnation. This hope is chastened by the verdict of the first lesson. There will not always be time to change the course of your life. The reflection on conflict resolution in the epistle hopes for a less bloody process between believers. Millennia of Christian history have dashed and obliterated these hopes. Yet the promise is there for an anti-litigious, and dare I say, an anti-carceral society. We would have to have leaders as deeply trusted as the mother of her city, whose wisdom was unassailed, whose most painful decision was honored no matter the cost. It's worth noting she was not a monarch and did not have an army. Her people were under no compulsion or threat to follow her lead prior to the insurrectionists threatening to massacre them all. They simply trusted in her wisdom. While the gospel has been styled as Jewish rejection of Jesus in some interpretations, an anti-Semitic reading that should be rejected, it displays profoundly human behavior common to all. Every culture has biases. Every person has biases. How could this person from this place be a sage? Or, in conversation with the other readings, the one voice we trust to make life and death decisions on our behalf. Leadership requires fellowship. Healing requires receptivity, or medical compliance in contemporary terms. Without the consent of the governed, there is no governance. So they say. That is being severely tested in our time. The disbelief that the heir apparent to the Joseph & Sons contracting company could truly hold such wisdom and bear such power left Jesus well nigh powerless and only able to perform a few healings. The city mother had more respect from her people than he did. When he left them still sick and still dying, effectively cut off from his saving touch because they would not trust him with their lives. It is not difficult to imagine some dying rather than trusting that upstart mama's boy from Nazareth, while spending every last copper penny on medical treatments that were of no avail. These readings are about discernment and wisdom. Wisdom to lead, wisdom to follow, wisdom to trust, and the ancient principle that the way of wisdom is the way of life. And so I want you to think about, as you think about these readings, I want you to think about the part that I read about every culture has biases, and ask yourself, have I had a bias that I don't want things like that story read in this sacred space? Have I had a bias that even though we know through the ages women have led armies, they have defended cities, they have committed atrocities in the name of saving the many, even though we know these things, does it bristle when we read them? Do we have leftover piety from the beginning years of Christianity that has a depiction of a woman and it doesn't include playing volleyball with someone's head? Do we have a bias that in here, in this sanctuary, we only want to talk about hopeful things? Come on, Pastor Marie, when are you going to read that part in Isaiah that we like? Comfort, comfort my people. Or Matthew, come to me all you who are weary. Or even John, I am the resurrection and the life. Those are the parts we like best, right? We've heard them over and over in the years growing up or whenever we began to hear them or read them, and they bring us great comfort. What Wil Gafney has done this year is to emphasize the point that great comfort does not bring about the kind of change in culture that we need in the United States if we were ever to move beyond all the horror that we read every single day in the news. If people are going to fully begin to seek to understand, to be curious instead of judgmental, to notice their own internal biases when they flare up, and to truly live their lives out as a follower of Jesus Christ, doing what Jesus would do, saying what Jesus would say, then we have to be willing to talk about what people need to talk about. Take mental illness. Last week, I believe, was Mental Health Week. What we do in this country, it seems, is we compartmentalize. We should talk about the history of what has happened to black people during February. We should talk about the history of women in March. We'll give mental health 1 week in October, right? That tends to be the way we do it. Why are we so uncomfortable talking about these things that we have to put them on the calendar for all to see and make sure that we weave them in for a month or a week? Why? Mental health affects everyone. It affects every single family. I would venture a guess that it affects everyone here at some time or another. And yet we don't talk about it. I think part of the wisdom in our lessons today may simply be this: communities that genuinely seek healing, that seek growth, communities that are about truth and solidarity with one another are not afraid to talk about difficult things. They hear the voice of wisdom urging them to do so, even if they have to initiate the conversation. And if we look back at the gospel and what Jesus did, Jesus looked at the people and said, I see you don't want to talk about this. I'm going to ease on down the road and find a community that will. May we be the community that invites Jesus to pull up a chair. We need to talk.
You just heard from Reverend Marie Duquette, pastor at King of Kings in Ann Arbor, Michigan. You can help support this ministry by texting your contribution to 833-950-1405. That's the U.S. 833-950-1405. You can find the full service video on YouTube Live at BE Lifted. Drop us a comment or join us on live chat at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Sunday mornings.